Daniel Whitaker walked home at an unhurried pace, his briefcase hanging from his hand, his jacket unbuttoned despite the cool Des Moines air. The street was familiar in the way that only routines could be. Rows of modest houses, porch lights flickering on one by one. The distant sound of traffic softening as evening settled in. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing dramatic ever seemed to happen, where days blended gently into one another. Daniel had chosen it for that very reason. As he walked, his thoughts returned, as they always did at this hour, to his family, to Emily, to their twin sons, barely old enough to form sentences, but already loud, curious, and endlessly energetic. The boys would be waiting for him now, toddling across the living room, fighting over the same toy despite having dozens scattered around the house. Emily would be there too, probably in the kitchen, finishing dinner with the patience and quiet focus that still amazed him after all these years. From the outside, their life was everything it was supposed to be. Daniel had a solid job as an engineer, one that paid well enough to keep them comfortable without excess. There were no overdue bills, no sleepless nights over money. Promotions came steadily, recognition followed his work, and his name carried weight in the office. He was respected, needed, secure, at home. The warmth was different, but just as real. Emily had settled into motherhood with a natural ease that Daniel sometimes felt he could only admire from the sidelines. She was gentle with the boys, attentive without hovering, firm when needed, but never harsh. There was a quiet intelligence to the way she handled their family, as if she understood instinctively what was required of each moment. Daniel often watched her without her noticing, struck by the fact that this life, this woman, these children had become his. He loved her deeply, though not loudly. His affection was expressed in small gestures, taking over bedtime when she looked exhausted, fixing things around the house before she even had to ask, listening when she spoke about her day, even if the details seemed small. He was proud of what they had built together, not in a grand way, but in the steady sense of accomplishment that came from endurance rather than excitement. Once, not long after the twins were born, Emily had mentioned adoption. It hadn't been a plan, not even a serious proposal. Just a thought she had voiced one evening while folding laundry. Her tone calm and reflective. She spoke about children who needed homes, about how love didn't always follow bloodlines. Daniel remembered nodding, surprised not by the idea itself, but by how naturally it seemed to belong to her. It wasn't a goal she pushed, nor something she returned to often. It was simply a value she carried quietly, the same way she carried everything else. Daniel had thought about that conversation more than once since then, not because he disagreed, but because it lingered in his mind, unconnected to any immediate decision, like a seed planted without expectation. He turned onto the next block, hands deep in his pockets now, and noticed that familiar sensation tightening in his chest again. It had been there since midday, faint but persistent, a heaviness that didn't quite qualify as worry. Not fear, not sadness, something undefined, like the sense that a word was missing from a sentence he'd already read too many times. There was no reason for it. Work was going well, better than well. If he was honest, his supervisor had hinted at another promotion before the end of the year. At home, nothing was wrong. The boys were healthy. Emily was happy, or at least seemed to be. There were no arguments waiting for him behind the front door, no unresolved conflicts demanding attention. And yet, the feeling refused to leave. Daniel slowed slightly as he passed a row of small storefronts, their windows glowing under fluorescent lights. He told himself it was nothing, just fatigue perhaps, the accumulated weight of responsibility. Everyone felt this way sometimes, didn't they? Life wasn't supposed to be exhilarating all the time. Stability came with its own kind of quiet. Still, as he continued down the street, the sense of unease followed him like a shadow, stretching just far enough behind to remain unnoticed, but never far enough to disappear. He did not yet understand what it meant, only that it was there, settling itself gently into an otherwise complete life, waiting. Daniel slowed as he approached the corner, where a small flower stall stood beneath a faded awning. It was the kind of place he had passed dozens of times without noticing, a narrow counter crowded with buckets of water and uneven bouquets, their colors bright against the gray of the sidewalk. He might have walked past again if not for the sound of a child's voice, thin, strained, and unmistakably earnest. He stopped a few steps away, pretending to check his phone, and listened. The girl couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. She was tall for her age, but painfully thin, her clothes clearly worn beyond their time. Her shorts were too small, the fabric faded and frayed at the edges. A cheap t-shirt hung loosely on her frame, marked by stains that had been washed again and again without ever fully disappearing. Her knees bore the faint scabs of old scrapes, the kind that came from falling often and healing without much attention. She stood on her toes to see over the counter, clutching a handful of coins and crumpled bills in her palm. "I saved what I could," she said quietly, pushing the money forward. "But it's not enough." "I know. Maybe there's something cheaper." The vendor, a heavy-set woman with bright makeup and a tight mouth, barely looked at the money. She crossed her arms and exhaled sharply. "Cheapest flower I have is still more than that," she said flatly. "Roses cost more. Carnations, too. Even the simple ones. You're short." The girl nodded, as if she had expected the answer. Still, she didn't move away. "It's my mom's birthday today," she said. "I bring her flowers every year. She'll be waiting." There was something in the way she said it, certain, almost ritualistic, that caught Daniel's attention. The child wasn't bargaining. She was stating a fact, as if the world itself should recognize the importance of the day. The vendor snorted. "Then draw her a card," she replied. "Plenty of people manage without flowers." The girl swallowed. Her fingers tightened around the coins. "I can't," she said softly. "I have to bring flowers." The woman leaned closer now, her expression hardening. "And you expect me to pay the rest for you? Out of my own pocket? This isn't a charity." Daniel felt something twist in his chest. He watched the girl's shoulders tense, the way her chin lifted slightly, as if she were holding herself together through sheer will. Maybe there's just one," the girl tried again. "Just one small one. I don't need a bouquet." The vendor laughed, a short, humorless sound. "If you want free flowers, there's a field across the road. Plenty growing there. Pick those." The girl's eyes flickered, and for a moment Daniel thought she might cry. But she didn't. Instead, she stood there a few seconds longer, as if hoping the woman might change her mind simply by being looked at. When it didn't happen, the girl lowered her hand. The coins clinked together as she closed her fist. Her shoulders slumped, the fight leaving her all at once. Without another word, she stepped back from the stall. Daniel watched her turn away slowly, her head bowed, her steps small and careful. The defeat in her posture was unmistakable, not loud, not dramatic, but complete. Something shifted inside him then. The unease he had carried all afternoon sharpened into clarity. He thought of his own sons, of Emily's patience, of the safety waiting for him at home. And then he thought of this child walking away empty-handed, not because she wanted something for herself, but because she had failed, in her own mind, to honor her mother. Daniel took a breath. He knew, with a certainty that surprised him, that he could not keep walking. "Hey," Daniel said gently, stepping toward the girl as she turned away. He kept his voice low, careful not to startle her. "Wait a second." She stopped, but didn't immediately look at him. When she did, her eyes were wary, assessing the way children learn to be when the world taught them caution early. She shifted her weight back a step, instinctively creating distance. "I heard you talking to the lady," Daniel continued. "You're short a little, right?" The girl nodded once, barely perceptible. "It's okay." she said quickly, as if afraid of imposing. I'll figure something out. Before Daniel could respond, the vendor leaned over the counter, her voice sharp. Don't encourage her, she said, eyes narrowing at him. She's always got a story. That one's a liar. Comes from a family of drunks. No mother waiting for flowers. The girl's head snapped up. Her cheeks flushed, not with shame, but with something closer to anger. I do have a mom, she said, her voice steady despite the tremor beneath it. And it is her birthday. You don't know anything. The woman scoffed. Watch how she talks, she muttered, as if seeking Daniel's agreement. Rude little thing. Grows like a weed, no one watching. Daniel didn't look at the vendor again. He focused entirely on the girl, on the way her fingers clenched around her small bundle of money, on the stubborn line of her mouth as she refused to back down. You don't need to explain anything to anyone, he said quietly. I can help, if you want. The girl hesitated. Suspicion flickered across her face, followed by uncertainty. I don't want something expensive, she said at once. Just one flower. Daniel smiled, a small, reassuring expression. How about this, he said. You choose what you think your mom would like. Don't worry about the price. Her eyes widened. She shook her head. No, that's too much. I can't. It's okay, Daniel interrupted gently but firmly. I mean it. The vendor rolled her eyes and began rearranging buckets with exaggerated movements. Suit yourself, she muttered. Your money. The girl stood frozen for a moment, then slowly turned back toward the stall. She walked past the cheaper flowers, her gaze drifting upward to the fuller arrangements. The price tags made her flinch. She clasped her hands behind her back, rocking slightly on her heels. Daniel waited without rushing her. Finally, her eyes landed on a bouquet tucked slightly to the side. Pale blue flowers filled it, unusual, almost luminous, and nestled among them were small ballerina figurines, delicate and airy as if caught mid-motion. The arrangement looked less like something practical and more like something imagined. That one is very expensive, the girl said softly, almost to herself. Daniel followed her gaze and nodded. It's beautiful, he said, if that's the one you like. She glanced at him, searching his face for doubt or hesitation. Finding none, she nodded, barely able to contain the sudden brightness in her expression. Yes, she whispered. That one. Daniel paid without comment. The vendor wrapped the bouquet briskly, her earlier disdain replaced by a thin, professional smile. When the flowers were placed into the girl's arms, she gasped, hugging them close as if afraid they might vanish. Thank you, she said, breathless. Thank you so much. She said it again and again, each time more earnest than the last. Daniel knelt briefly to her level. Happy birthday to your mom, he said. And you stay kind, no matter what. The girl nodded, clutching the bouquet like something precious. Then she turned and hurried away, her steps lighter now, almost skipping. Daniel watched her go, warmth spreading through his chest. He felt lighter too, steadier, as if something had aligned itself quietly inside him. He didn't know yet that this simple moment, this choice to stop, had already begun to stir memories and truths he had long believed were settled. Daniel walked the remaining distance to his car with the bouquet's colors still bright in his mind, the image refusing to fade as quickly as he expected. He unlocked the door, slid into the driver's seat, and sat there without starting the engine. The street outside had grown quieter, the evening settling into its usual rhythm. A radio murmured faintly from a nearby vehicle. Somewhere a door closed. Life moved on uninterrupted, and yet the heaviness returned, stronger now, unmistakable. My mother's birthday. The words echoed again, clear and insistent. Daniel's hands tightened on the steering wheel as understanding surfaced with sudden force. He hadn't forgotten the date. Not really. He had simply learned, over the years, to live as if it no longer mattered. Today was Caroline Whitaker's birthday. The realization struck him with a sharpness that stole his breath for a moment. He leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on the windshield. As the past opened quietly but completely, it didn't rush in. It didn't overwhelm him all at once. It arrived the way it always did, with detail, with texture, with the certainty of something that had never truly left. He saw his grandmother's apartment first. The 3-story brick building on the edge of the city. The courtyard worn smooth by decades of footsteps. Summers there had felt like a different world. One governed by freedom rather than schedules. His grandmother's kitchen smelled of tea and warm bread. Evenings were slow and unhurried. She told him stories before bed, her voice steady and familiar. And Daniel slept deeply in that place, untroubled by the expectations that waited for him elsewhere. That was where he had met Caroline. She appeared one afternoon among the neighborhood children, introduced by a boy Daniel already knew. Caroline, he had said, as if the name explained itself. Daniel remembered thinking it sounded strange then, too elegant, too deliberate for a girl their age. Caroline herself had shrugged when someone commented on it, complaining that it didn't suit her, that she would have preferred something simpler. She smiled when she said it, not embarrassed, just resigned. She had worn a pale blue sundress that day, her dark hair braided neatly, ribbons tied with care. Even then, there was something about her that drew attention without demanding it. She didn't shout. She didn't push to the front of games. She simply existed, calm and observant, and somehow the world adjusted around her. Daniel remembered how easily she fit into his days after that. They walked home together, shared snacks, sat side by side on the steps while others ran past. She laughed quietly, but when she did, it felt like a gift meant only for the person beside her. With Caroline, Daniel never felt the need to perform. He could be silent without discomfort. He could speak without planning. As they grew older, that closeness remained. Summers turned into years, and childhood games gave way to long conversations and shared glances that carried more weight than words. Caroline grew into her beauty naturally, without effort or awareness. Her features sharpened, her presence deepened, but her manner never changed. She stayed kind, open, unassuming. Daniel loved her long before he understood what love meant. He loved the way she listened, the way she noticed small things, the way she treated everyone with the same quiet respect. He loved her before he had the language to claim it, and by the time he did, fear had already taken root. He convinced himself it was safer to remain what he was to her, a friend, someone dependable, someone present. He told himself that saying nothing was a form of protection, that if Caroline never knew how deeply he felt, he would never risk losing her altogether. There were moments, even now, that returned to him unbidden. The look she gave him when he stood up for her once, his heart pounding as if he were facing something far greater than he was. The way she smiled at him across a crowded courtyard, her eyes lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. He wondered, still, whether she had known, whether she had waited for him in the same quiet way he had waited for her. He remembered her birthdays most clearly, not because they were celebrated with parties or gifts, there were rarely any, but because she treated the day as something sacred in its own modest way. She never asked for much. She spoke of what she wanted in simple terms, as if careful not to burden anyone. Daniel, still a boy then, saved what little money he had. He bought small things, plastic trinkets, cheap figurines, hair clips, and Caroline received them as if they were treasures. She never laughed at the simplicity. She never compared them to what others had. Her gratitude was real, and it filled him with a happiness he didn't know how to name. Daniel closed his eyes briefly in the car, the weight of memory pressing gently but firmly against his chest. He thought of the girl at the flower stall, of her determination, of the way she spoke about her mother as if the act of bringing flowers were a promise that could not be broken. Some dates did not belong to the past, no matter how much time passed around them. They stayed where they were planted, waiting. Daniel opened his eyes again. The street outside unchanged. He started the engine at last, knowing without certainty but with quiet clarity that the day was not finished with him yet. Adolescence arrived without ceremony, and with it came changes that neither Daniel nor Caroline spoke about directly. Their neighborhood thinned as families moved away. Children grew older, and the rhythm of shared summers gave way to scattered meetings and brief encounters. Yet their connection endured. It didn't demand attention. It didn't announce itself. It simply remained quiet, consistent, resilient. They learned how to exist alongside one another in new ways. Conversations stretched longer, grew more thoughtful. Silences became meaningful rather than awkward. Caroline listened the way she always had, with a steady focus that made Daniel feel seen without being examined. He noticed how she carried herself now, how people's eyes followed her even when she seemed unaware of it. Her beauty had matured, sharpened by time, but it never hardened her. She remained gentle, unassuming, unchanged at her core. Daniel watched from a careful distance. He told himself it was enough to be near her, to know her life as it unfolded. He pursued his studies, worked part-time, began to shape a future that felt practical and attainable. Caroline attended technical school, chosen not by her own ambition, but by what her mother considered sensible. She didn't complain. She rarely did. It was the death of Daniel's grandmother that fractured what little protection time had provided. The call came suddenly. There was no long illness, no slow preparation. One day she was there and the next she wasn't. The apartment that had once been full of warmth became quiet, emptied of its meaning. Daniel moved through the days afterward in a haze, attending the funeral, receiving condolences, doing what was expected without fully understanding how the world could continue as if nothing essential had been lost. After the mourners left and his parents drove away, Daniel remained in the apartment alone. He sat at the small kitchen table where his grandmother used to drink tea, the chair across from him empty. It was there, in the quiet of late afternoon, that the door opened. Caroline stepped inside without knocking. She stood in the doorway for a moment, as if uncertain whether she still belonged there. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed red. She hadn't planned what to say, that much was clear. "I thought you might leave," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel looked at her, confused. "Leave where?" "This place," she said, gesturing vaguely. "With your grandmother gone. I didn't know if you'd still come here. And if you don't," her words trailed off, unfinished, heavy with what she could not bring herself to say. In that moment, everything Daniel had buried rose to the surface. Fear, longing, regret. He understood suddenly what she was really asking. Not about the apartment, about him. "I didn't come here just for her," he said quietly. Caroline's eyes lifted to his, searching. "I came here because of you," he continued. The words felt inevitable now, long overdue. "I don't know how to explain it properly. I never have. But I need to see you. I need you in my life. I always have." She didn't speak at first. She only stared at him, her expression unreadable. Then her shoulders relaxed, just slightly, as if something she had been holding finally loosened. "I thought I was imagining it," she said. "All this time." Daniel took a step closer. "You weren't." The silence between them shifted. It was no longer filled with restraint, but with recognition. Caroline smiled then, not brightly, not playfully, but with a relief so clear it nearly broke him. "I felt the same," she said, "for a long time." Their relationship began without urgency. There were no dramatic declarations, no sudden changes. They walked together as they always had, talked as they always had, but now there was intention where there had once been hesitation. Daniel held her hand for the first time as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Caroline leaned into him with a trust that felt earned rather than claimed. They were happy. Quietly so. It didn't last. Irene Whittaker noticed the change immediately. Caroline came home later than usual. She smiled more often. She seemed lighter, distracted in a way Irene did not approve of. It took little effort to uncover the source. The confrontation was swift and unmistakable. Irene did not raise her voice at first. She never needed to. Her disapproval was cold, precise. She questioned Daniel's background, his prospects, his usefulness. She dismissed his studies as uncertain, his future as insufficient. To her, love was a distraction. Stability was measured in income, status, appearance. "You're wasting your time," she told Caroline. "And his." Caroline tried to explain. Irene cut her off. "This is not what I raised you for," she said. "Your looks are not a gift to be thrown away on sentiment." Daniel was summoned soon after. Irene faced him without embarrassment or restraint. "You're not what she needs," she said plainly. "You have nothing to offer her. No money, no security, no future worth waiting for." Daniel tried to speak. He explained his plans, his work, his determination. Irene listened without interest. "Intentions don't pay for comfort," she replied, "and love doesn't last." Her demand was simple. He was to stay away. Daniel understood then that this was not a misunderstanding to be resolved with patience. Irene did not oppose him personally. She opposed the idea that Caroline's life should be shaped by anything other than her own ambition. In her mind, Caroline was an investment, a path out of hardship, a means to an end. The pressure intensified. Irene monitored Caroline's movements, her calls, her time. She spoke of opportunities elsewhere, of men with means and influence. She reminded her daughter of everything she had sacrificed, of the life she herself had been denied. Caroline resisted as best she could, but resistance came quietly to her. She did not know how to fight without hurting, and Irene knew it. Daniel felt the walls closing in. The happiness he had just found was already under threat, not from doubt or distance, but from control. And for the first time, he realized that love alone might not be enough to protect them. Daniel waited 3 days before asking to see Irene again. He used the time to steady himself, to rehearse the words he believed might finally reach her. He told himself that respect could still matter, that clarity and composure might succeed where emotion had failed. He dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a jacket that made him look older, more established than he felt. He brought no gifts. He wanted to be taken seriously, not appease her. Irene received him in the living room of her apartment, seated upright on the edge of a leather chair. The room was neat to the point of sterility, every surface polished, every object placed with intention. She did not invite him to sit. She did not offer coffee. Daniel spoke calmly. He explained his plans, his work, the stability he was building. He spoke of commitment, of patience, of time. He told her he loved Caroline and intended to marry her when he was able. He did not plead. He did not raise his voice. He tried, with careful precision, to show her that he was not reckless, not temporary, not a risk. Irene listened with an expression that never changed. When he finished, she stood and walked to the window, her back to him. For a moment, Daniel thought he had finally reached her. Then she spoke. "You are still talking about feelings," she said, "as if they matter." She turned, her eyes cold. "You are not enough. You will never be enough. And I will not allow my daughter to waste her life waiting for you to become something you are not." Daniel tried once more. He spoke of Caroline's happiness, of her choice, of the harm control could cause. Irene's lips curved slightly, not in amusement but in dismissal. "Happiness is temporary," she replied. "Security lasts." Her voice sharpened. "Stay away from her. This is not a request." Daniel left the apartment with a sense of finality he could not yet define. He walked for a long time afterward, trying to understand how reason could fail so completely. He did not see the men who followed him until it was too late. They approached him from behind as he cut through a dimly lit parking lot near the apartment complex. One grabbed his arm, twisting it sharply. Another struck him across the back of the head. Daniel stumbled, confusion erupting into pain. He tried to turn, to see their faces, but blows came from all sides, methodical and merciless. He heard one of them speak, low and deliberate. "This is your warning." The world narrowed to sound and impact. He felt the crunch of bone, the burn of skin breaking, the shock of his body hitting the ground. When it was over, they left him where he lay, breath shallow, vision fading. Daniel woke in a hospital bed, lights glaring above him. Pain radiated through his body in waves, sharp and unrelenting. A nurse spoke his name. A doctor explained the injuries: broken ribs, a fractured wrist, internal bruising, a concussion. He was alive. He would recover. Slowly. Caroline did not come. At first, Daniel assumed she had not been told. He asked a nurse to let her know where he was. Hours passed, then days. His phone remained silent. When he tried to call her, the line went dead, disconnected. The silence stretched, heavy and absolute. Daniel lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying their last conversation, searching for something he might have missed. He told himself there had been a mistake, that Irene had intervened again, that Caroline would find a way through. She didn't. By the time Daniel was discharged, Caroline was gone. He returned to the apartment he once shared with his grandmother, moving through rooms that felt hollow now. He waited. He called mutual friends. No one knew where she was. Some avoided his questions entirely. Others spoke carefully, as if afraid of saying too much. Weeks passed. Then one evening, his phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. Daniel answered without thinking. There was a pause on the line, filled with static and distance. "Daniel," Caroline said. Her voice was different, flat, measured, as if each word had been rehearsed. "Where are you?" he asked at once. "I've been trying to reach you. I was in the hospital." I know," she interrupted quietly. "I'm sorry." The words landed without comfort. "I can't talk long," she continued. "I'm calling from someone else's phone." Daniel's heart began to pound. "What's going on?" "I'm getting married," she said. The sentence felt unreal, as if spoken in another language. "I'm leaving," she added. "Soon." "Where?" Daniel asked. "Caroline, where are you going?" She didn't answer immediately. When she did, her voice wavered for the first time. "It doesn't matter. It's far. Outside the country." "Why?" he asked. The word came out broken. "I don't have a choice," she said. "This is how it has to be." Daniel pressed the phone closer to his ear, desperate to bridge the distance. "Listen to me. Whatever this is, we can fix it. I can wait. I can do more. I love you." There was a breath on the other end. Shallow. Controlled. "I know," Caroline said. "That's why I'm calling." Then the line went dead. Daniel stood there long after the call ended. Phone still pressed to his ear, as if the connection might return if he willed it. It didn't. He understood then what had truly happened. Not a misunderstanding. Not a fading of feeling. Caroline had been removed from his life with precision and force, displaced by power that did not ask permission. Love had not failed them. It had simply been overruled. Daniel lowered the phone slowly, the weight of that knowledge settling into him with a permanence he could not escape. Something had broken, not just between him and Caroline, but within him as well. It was a fracture that would never fully heal, only scar over with time. And though he did not yet know it, this moment marked the point beyond which nothing could be undone. The truth reached Daniel years later, without warning and without mercy. He was sitting alone in his office late one evening, scrolling absently through news on his phone while waiting for a report to finish downloading. The headline caught his attention, not because it mentioned her name. At first it didn't, but because of a photograph. A blurred image of a woman being escorted into a courthouse. Her face partially hidden, her posture rigid with restraint. He clicked. It took only a few lines for recognition to settle in. Slow and devastating. Caroline Whitaker. The article referred to her as the wife of a prominent foreign businessman, a man whose wealth and political connections had long placed him beyond ordinary scrutiny. Daniel read the words once, then again, as if repetition might soften their meaning. Caroline had married him less than a year after leaving the United States. The article outlined the trajectory of her life abroad with clinical distance. The move was framed as an opportunity, financial security, cultural enrichment, a future defined by comfort. What it did not say outright, but implied through omission, was how little of that future had belonged to her. Daniel read on. From the beginning, Caroline's world had narrowed. Friends disappeared first, then acquaintances. Her phone access became limited. Visits home were postponed, then canceled altogether. She learned quickly which questions were acceptable and which were not. The house she lived in was large, guarded, and silent. Privacy existed only for those who controlled it. The article cited unnamed sources, later corroborated by legal documents and testimony. It spoke of patterns rather than moments. Verbal degradation that escalated into physical intimidation, isolation justified as protection, restrictions framed as concern. Caroline's husband monitored her movements, her communications, her expressions. Even her body became subject to expectation. When Caroline became pregnant, the scrutiny intensified. Her husband's interest sharpened, not with tenderness, but with demand. Doctors were chosen for her. Appointments were supervised. The pregnancy was treated less as a shared experience and more as a test she was required to pass. She gave birth to a daughter. The child was named Catherine. For a brief period, motherhood gave Caroline something she had not known she was missing, an anchor. The article described witnesses who spoke of her clinging to the child with a protectiveness that bordered on desperation. For a time she endured. She adjusted. She complied where necessary, resisted where she could. Catherine became her reason for waking, for enduring the hours that blurred into one another. But the child also made Caroline more vulnerable. Her husband's disappointment was not subtle. He had wanted a son. The birth of a daughter was treated as a failure, a personal affront. The blame, unspoken but unmistakable, settled entirely on Caroline. His patience evaporated. His temper shortened. The abuse escalated. What had once been contained to closed rooms began to leave marks. Bruises explained away. Falls accounted for. Doctors who asked questions were dismissed. Domestic staff were replaced frequently, discouraged from forming attachments or noticing patterns. Cultural barriers and legal loopholes worked in his favor. Caroline was a foreigner. Her husband was influential. Complaints disappeared into bureaucratic silence. Daniel read every word with a growing sense of suffocation. He imagined Caroline navigating this life with the same quiet dignity she had always carried, now twisted into endurance. He imagined her calculating every movement, every word, not for herself, but for her child. He imagined the isolation, not just physical, but emotional, the absence of anyone who knew her before, anyone who might see what was happening and call it what it was. The article reached its conclusion with brutal efficiency. One night, neighbors reported hearing a disturbance. Police arrived too late. Caroline was taken to the hospital unconscious, her injuries extensive and unmistakable. She never regained consciousness. She died 2 days later. The case that followed attracted attention far beyond what her life ever had. Media outlets seized on the contrast. wealth and violence, power and impunity. Human rights organizations became involved. Pressure mounted. Evidence surfaced that could no longer be ignored. The husband was arrested, tried, and eventually sentenced to a lengthy prison term. Justice, the article suggested, had been served. Daniel closed his phone and sat motionless for a long time. Caroline's death had become a public tragedy, framed by headlines and legal outcomes. Commentators debated the case. Advocates cited it as proof of systemic failures and eventual accountability. Her name was spoken widely, but always in fragments, reduced to a symbol rather than a person. What no article captured was the full weight of her life. The girl who once complained about her own name. The woman who loved quietly and endured fiercely. The mother who had fought invisibly to protect her child in a world that gave her no allies. Daniel thought of the last call, of the flatness in Caroline's voice, of the way she had said she had no choice. He understood now what that had meant. The knowledge settled into him slowly, reshaping memories he had carried for years. Guilt surfaced, not because he believed he could have saved her, but because he had survived, because he had been allowed to build a life while hers had been dismantled piece by piece. He did not cry, not then. The grief was heavier than tears, anchored too deeply for release. Daniel rose from his chair and looked out the office window at the darkened city below. Lights glowed in distant buildings, indifferent and steady. Life continued, as it always did, layered over loss without pause. Somewhere in that distant country, Caroline had lived and died unseen by the world that once knew her as a girl with quiet grace. Her suffering had remained private until it could no longer be hidden, and even then it was simplified into something consumable. Daniel understood one final truth as he stood there alone. Caroline's death had been acknowledged, but her life, her fear, her endurance, her love for her child had remained largely invisible, and that, he realized, was the final cruelty. The article did not leave Daniel's mind when he closed his laptop. It followed him home, sat with him through the night, and greeted him again in the morning. Every sentence replayed with cruel precision, each detail reshaping the past until nothing felt stable anymore. He returned to work out of habit, answered emails mechanically, attended meetings without absorbing a word. Inside, something had come apart. He told himself he should have fought harder, that he should have ignored Irene's threats, gone to the police after the beating, found Caroline no matter what it cost him. The logic was merciless and endless. Every memory turned into an accusation. The love he had once guarded so carefully now felt like a failure of courage. Sleep became unreliable. When it came, it brought images he could not control. Caroline's face, pale and distant, the hospital room he had never seen, a child crying somewhere beyond reach. When sleep refused him, he drank. At first, it was a single glass in the evening, then another. Soon, it was the only way he could quiet his thoughts long enough to exist. Daniel stopped returning calls. He avoided friends. Weekends dissolved into hours spent staring at walls, the television playing without sound. His work began to suffer. Deadlines were missed. A supervisor pulled him aside, concern edging into warning. Daniel nodded, promised improvement, and meant it in theory, even as he felt himself slipping further away. It was at a bar not far from his office that Emily noticed him. She saw him the way people who listened for a living learn to see, without judgment, without curiosity disguised as kindness. Daniel came in at irregular hours, ordered the same drink, and sat alone. He didn't complain. He didn't perform grief. He simply existed in a quiet, exhausted way that made itself known. Emily didn't ask questions. She didn't tell him stories to distract him. She refilled his glass when he asked and left him alone when he didn't. Sometimes she offered a brief comment about the weather or the music, nothing that demanded a response. Sometimes she simply nodded when he paid. One night, after he had been sitting there for hours, she placed a glass of water in front of him without a word. Daniel looked at it, then at her. She met his gaze calmly. "Take a break," she said. Not unkindly. He did. That small interruption mattered more than he understood at the time. Over weeks, the routine shifted. Daniel began ordering less. He started talking, not about the past, but about ordinary things. Work frustrations, the noise in his apartment, the way time felt uneven. Emily listened without steering the conversation anywhere it wasn't ready to go. When he went quiet, she let the silence stand. She did not try to rescue him. She did not tell him who he should be. She allowed him to move at his own pace, even when that pace was painfully slow. Gradually, Daniel began to return to himself. He cut back on drinking. He slept more regularly. He repaired what he could at work, focused on tasks small enough to manage. Emily remained present, steady in a way that felt unfamiliar but safe. Their relationship did not begin with romance. It began with trust. They started seeing each other outside the bar, coffee after her shifts, walks that went nowhere in particular. Daniel told her about Caroline eventually, haltingly without drama. Emily listened, her expression unchanged, absorbing the story without trying to resolve it. "I'm sorry," she said when he finished. Nothing more, nothing less. They married quietly. There were no grand promises, no illusions about healing being complete. They chose one another not because the past had loosened its grip, but because the present felt survivable together. They tried for children and failed. They tried again and failed again. The disappointment was heavy, familiar in its own way. When IVF was suggested, Daniel hesitated, unsure if he was allowed to hope for anything more. Emily held his hand and told him they would decide together. The twins were born on a cold morning, small and perfect and loud. Daniel held them with awe, fear, and a gratitude that bordered on disbelief. Life reshaped itself around feedings, sleepless nights, laughter that arrived unexpectedly. Caroline did not disappear from his thoughts. She never would. But she no longer occupied every waking moment. Her memory became part of the structure of his life rather than the thing that threatened to collapse it. Daniel had built something new, not because he had forgotten, but because he had learned how to live alongside what could not be undone. Daniel returned to the flower stall just before closing. The street had quieted, the late afternoon light slanting low between buildings. This time he did not linger. He asked for daisies, simple, white, unadorned, the kind Caroline had always liked. He paid, thanked the vendor, and walked away without another word. The cemetery lay on the outskirts of the city, familiar enough that Daniel no longer needed directions. He parked, stepped out of the car, and stood for a moment with the bouquet in his hands, steadying himself. He visited rarely, not because he had forgotten, but because remembering here required a different kind of strength. Caroline's grave was modest, well kept but quiet. No photograph, just her name, dates, and the space between them that held everything that had been lost. Daniel stopped. Another bouquet rested there already. Pale blue flowers, delicate ballerina figurines woven between the stems. The same bouquet. His breath caught sharply. For a moment, he thought he must be mistaken, that his grief had begun to rearrange reality. He stepped closer. No, there was no doubt. The arrangement was identical down to the smallest detail. The girl's face rose in his mind with sudden clarity. The careful way she had held the flowers, the seriousness in her eyes when she spoke about her mother, the way she had said, "I bring her flowers every year." Daniel lowered himself onto the bench beside the grave, the daisies slipping slightly in his grasp. The realization did not come as a single thought, but as a collapse of distance, years folding inward, memory and present colliding. Catherine, Caroline's daughter. He stayed there for a long time, unable to speak, unable to move, the truth settling into him with a weight that felt both crushing and clarifying. When he finally placed his bouquet beside the other, his hands trembled. There was only one person who could explain the rest. Daniel found Irene in the early evening, sitting on a bench outside a weathered apartment building. She looked smaller than he remembered, older. Her clothes were unkempt, her movements sluggish. An open bottle rested near her feet. She recognized him immediately. "Daniel," she said hoarsely. There was no anger left in her voice, only exhaustion. They sat in silence for a while. Then, without being asked, Irene began to speak. She told him everything. How she had engineered Caroline's meeting with the foreign businessman. How she had dismissed the early signs of control as cultural differences. How she had told herself that wealth compensated for fear, that obedience would bring safety. How she had silenced her daughter's doubts and reframed bruises as misunderstandings. Her voice broke when she spoke of the first time Caroline begged to leave. She said she was scared, Irene whispered. I told her she was ungrateful. She admitted that when Catherine was sent back after Caroline's death, she had barely been sober enough to understand what was happening. The father's family wanted nothing to do with the child. No son, no heir. The money disappeared as quickly as it had arrived. I tried, Irene said, tears streaking down her face. But I can't do this anymore. I can't be what she needs. Daniel listened without interruption. There was no satisfaction in hearing Irene's regret, no sense of justice, only the hollow knowledge that everything she confessed had come too late. And the girl? Daniel asked quietly. Catherine. Irene nodded. She goes to the flower stall, saves what she can, says it's important. She laughed weakly, then sobbed. Just like her mother. Daniel closed his eyes. In that moment, the choice clarified itself with startling certainty, not as an impulse, not as a gesture of redemption, but as responsibility, plain and unavoidable. Catherine was not a symbol. She was a child, a living continuation of the woman he had loved. And she was alone. Daniel stood. She won't be any more, he said. Irene looked up at him, confused. Then understanding flickered, followed by something like relief. You'd really, she began, unable to finish. Daniel nodded once. Yes. He left Irene there, knowing there was nothing more to say. The past had already taken everything it could. What remained was the present, and the child who had survived it. As he walked back to his car, Daniel felt the weight of what lay ahead settle into him. Not fear, not hesitation. Purpose. For the first time since he had stood by Caroline's grave years ago, he knew exactly what he was meant to do next. Daniel did not speak at first when he came home. He washed his hands, changed out of his jacket, and stood for a long moment in the doorway of the living room, watching the twins crawl across the rug, their laughter rising and falling in uneven bursts. Emily looked up from the couch and knew, instantly, that something had shifted. They waited until the boys were asleep. Daniel told her everything. He did not rush. He did not soften the truth. He spoke of the girl at the flower stall, of the grave, of the blue bouquet, of the realization that had struck him with such clarity it had left no room for doubt. He told her about Irene, about the years of control, the violence that had been ignored, the guilt that had hollowed her out. And finally he told her about Catherine. When he finished, he expected questions. He expected hesitation. Emily was quiet for a long moment. Then she reached for his hand. She's a child, Emily said simply. Daniel nodded. She shouldn't be alone. She won't be, Emily replied, without pause. There was no grand declaration in her voice, no dramatic certainty. Just resolve. We'll take her in. The decision felt less like a choice than a recognition. Years ago, Emily had spoken casually about adoption as something that mattered to her in principle. Now, that principle had found a name, a face, a child who needed more than sympathy. The first days were careful ones. Catherine arrived with a small backpack and a reserve that spoke of experience rather than shyness. She observed before she trusted. She slept lightly. She apologized for things that did not require apology. Emily noticed all of it without comment, making space without pressure. The twins accepted her immediately, as children often did. They followed her from room to room, fascinated, offering toys and unfiltered affection. Catherine responded cautiously at first, then with growing ease. She learned their routines. She learned where to sit at the table, where to place her shoes, where quiet lived in the house. Emily learned how to braid her hair. It was a small thing, but when Catherine caught her reflection in the mirror that first morning, her eyes widened with something close to disbelief. Emily smiled at her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "You ready?" she asked. Catherine nodded. Irene entered treatment shortly after. She signed the guardianship papers without argument. There were tears, apologies, moments of clarity and collapse. Daniel visited once, then again, keeping the boundaries firm and humane. He understood now that love without responsibility was not love at all. It was appetite, control, fear. Catherine visited Irene occasionally, accompanied, protected. She returned to Daniel and Emily's home each time with relief that grew easier to name. The house changed, not dramatically, not overnight, but steadily. A fourth toothbrush appeared in the bathroom. A jacket hung by the door. Homework spread across the kitchen table in the afternoons. Laughter came more easily, more often. Emily flourished in ways she had never expected. She had loved motherhood before, deeply and completely. But caring for Catherine filled a space she had quietly carried for years. She taught her how to bake, how to read a room, how to say no without apology. She listened when Catherine spoke about her mother, never correcting, never interrupting. Daniel watched from the edges of these moments, aware of the strange convergence of past and present. Caroline's daughter, laughing at his kitchen table, not as a symbol, not as redemption, but as a life unfolding. On the morning of Catherine's first day of school, the house buzzed with energy. The twins insisted on helping. Shoes were misplaced and found again. Breakfast was louder than usual. Emily checked and rechecked the backpack. Daniel adjusted a collar that didn't need adjusting. Catherine stood in the hallway, dressed neatly, hair braided, hands folded in front of her. She looked older than her years in that moment, composed and observant. "Ready?" Daniel asked. She hesitated, then nodded. "Yes." They walked together, not ceremonially, just together. At the school gates, Catherine turned back once, searching their faces. Emily smiled and gave her a small wave. Daniel held her gaze, steady and sure. "You're safe," he said. "We'll be right here." Catherine nodded again and walked forward. As they returned home, the house felt fuller than it ever had. That afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the windows and the twins napped, Daniel sat at the table and allowed himself to think not about what had been lost, but about what had been chosen. Family, he understood now, was not created by blood alone, not by money, not by control disguised as protection. It was created by the quiet decisions made when no one was watching, by showing up, by staying, by choosing responsibility even when it asked for everything. The act that had begun it all, a stranger stopping at a flower stall, had not been heroic. It had been ordinary, and yet it had changed the shape of several lives. Some kindnesses did that. They did not announce themselves. They did not promise resolution. They simply opened a door and asked whether someone would step through. Daniel had stepped through once, without knowing where it would lead. This time, he stepped forward with clarity. And this time he did not walk alone. For our listeners, what does family mean to you? Is it something you're born into, or something you choose, protect, and build over time? Share your thoughts in the comments. Sometimes It isn't grand ambition that changes a life, but a single, quiet act of kindness offered at the right moment.